So I like to start these conversations by learning about the person that we're meeting with. And in your case, you've had an interesting career trajectory and an interesting educational background. So I'm wondering if you would share with us a little bit about how you came to be in the really very demanding position at the UN that you are presently employed in.
Thank you so much, Jason, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. It's my pleasure to be here with you. So as I have been introduced, and thank you, Jason, for the question. It's always a privilege and a huge responsibility to speak on behalf of your own career trajectory, but also, how we got here, because everybody has its own path, of course. So in my case, and thank you for that intro as well, I'm from Argentina. I graduated law school from Argentina back home as a lawyer. And, I did have a specialization at the moment in international law or international legal affairs, but it's a pathway that you never really know what you can do with it, particularly when you come from a country that it's a little bit, like, I wouldn't say it's not part of discussions, but it's a little bit more into the context of perhaps Latin American type of, discussions, more at the regional level. It is a little bit more difficult to have meaningful interventions or discussions at the actual global level. So that was a question I asked myself at the very beginning. I graduated law school with an interest in international law, particular international public law, and then what to do with it. So I think the link to me became clear when I started looking into the possibilities of practicing at the international level. And one area that I had a strong legal background from home, because I had practiced at the domestic level, related to criminal justice and criminal law. So the interlinkages between criminal justice, criminal accountability at the domestic level, and its promotion at the domestic level by the international legal system gave me a little bit of a unique edge. Yeah.
Could you give us an example of what sorts of issues fall into that category?
For instance, thank you, Jason. Yes, for instance, when I was practicing law in Argentina as a recent graduate student, and also as a recent lawyer, just graduated lawyer, I worked at the Supreme Court of Argentina. And we were, at that level, I was not prosecuting cases, but I was supporting criminal justice related issues that were, like noted at the Supreme Court level, say constitutional claims vis-a-vis criminal justice cases. And some of the cases I was looking into related to what we would call accountability for the crimes of the past in Argentina, meaning those crimes committed during the several dictatorships that took place in Argentina in the 70s and into the 80s. And in that context, I was investigating issues pertaining to constitutional claims vis-a-vis enforced disappearances cases, torture, and, of course, in that context, I started to look at how those cases were being framed by prosecutors as cases with an international gravitas.
Right, because the International Criminal Court, which is part of the UN system, does have a fair amount of jurisdiction, doesn't it, over cases of serious human rights violations, up to and including genocide.
It does, and the 1998 Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court does create, and that's very specifically criminalize, distinct type of offenses that are deemed to be part of what we call international criminal justice or international criminal law gravitas. And of course, in that Rome Statute, several customary international law principles pertaining to accountability were crystallized. So it did not start from scratch. And in that context, yes, but of course it depends on the question of whether the ICC, the International Criminal Court, can exercise jurisdiction depends on what the states have done in that regard, and also the role of the Security Council.
Right. So when you say what the states have done, are you referring to each country's recognition of the International Court of Justice or failure to recognize, or is there more to it than that?
It's the ratification of the Rome Statute and the jurisdiction being accepted that the International Criminal Court can try their own individual nationals for the commission of those crimes.
Right.
But also, of course, as I'm sure everybody knows, the International Criminal Court is premised on the principle of complementarity. So that it also links back to my own experience, because the court is established not to prosecute every single crime that occurs in every single part of the world, but it's actually premised on the notion that the states have the primary responsibility to investigate and prosecute and, if appropriate, convict upon those crimes. And when the state is unable or unwilling, then the case can be referred to the International Criminal Court, or the prosecutor can initiate motu proprio an investigation.
Very interesting. Well, with that background, let's kind of pivot to the thing that we're supposed to be. I could talk about that forever. Let's pivot to the thing that we're actually supposed to be talking about, which is terrorism in the context of the international criminal justice system. And I guess I'm going to start you off with a difficult one. It was difficult for me, maybe easy for you. I think a lot of people, myself included, aren't sure whether terrorism is a criminal justice issue primarily, or whether it is a conflict and security issue primarily. And I'm wondering, well, first of all, what your sense of this is, and also what you can tell us about how the UN addresses that question.
Well, again, thank you, Jason. And I'm happy to also get questions later on these topics, because I do believe they raise quite a few of very substantive, I would say, fundamental issues in terms of issues pertaining to what terrorism is. And I don't want to be completely, like definitional in the space, but you may know that the United Nations member states have been for years trying to create or draft an international convention against terrorism under the 6th Committee of the General Assembly. And they never really, managed to do so. Because there are fundamental disagreements among member states. And I'm talking about the UN in terms of the political sphere, the 193 member states. I'm not talking about the Secretariat led by the Secretary General. So there are fundamental issues in terms of what terrorism is, but there are definitions, and I can talk about that a little bit. But to your question, in terms of how the UN looks at terrorism, whether as a security or a criminal justice. So I guess it's both. And I will explain a bit why. So one of the first actions taken by the Security Council, I'm talking about the 15 member states of the Security Council, not the General Assembly, upon the terrorist attacks against the United States on 9/11, was to come together and issue what it's called Chapter 7 resolution, Chapter 7 per the UN Charter, meaning that it's binding upon all member states to look into international terrorism as a threat to peace and security. So the Council acknowledged that those attacks in particular, but the linkages between different, non-state armed groups or individuals who were pursuing the commission of terrorist attacks elsewhere in the world was indeed a threat to the peace and security altogether, and something that the Security Council would look into. So that's one piece of the puzzle. In that initial resolution, which is numbered 1373 of 2001, issued in September 2001, all the 15 member states of the Security Council, the 15 ones that I mentioned, came together and said, member states, you should do 3 different things, which is quite a lot to say, because, the Council came together, 15 member states, to tell the whole wide world, all the UN membership, you should be doing 3 different things. First, you should be looking into how to curtail financing methods for terrorist purposes. So it kind of like in that moment, the nascent, area of terrorism financing and countering terrorism financing came to life. And they also said to member states, not only look into the financial linkages and try to start with it in preventive fashion, that's why it's a security kind of concern, we don't want this to happen, but also they said you should bring individual terrorists to justice. And when you use that language, you're clearly hinting to a couple of options, but one of it's the use of criminal justice to bring those individuals to justice, to be held accountable for the acts. And the third call was to cooperate internationally, to cooperate with other member states in further instance international, what it's called international judicial cooperation. If you're going to be bringing terrorists to justice vis-a-vis their domestic criminal law systems, you also need to cooperate, share information, share possible evidence, extradite. And if you're not extraditing a suspected terrorist perpetrator, then prosecute them at home. So all that accountability piece came very clearly and very forcefully, and more interestingly, so from the criminal justice perspective, the Council said, you member states, you should also criminalize in your domestic legal system a series of acts as serious enough to get, eventually investigated and prosecuted. And the language there related to issues very much preventive. If you support terrorism, if you finance terrorism, as I mentioned, if you prepare to commit a terrorist act, but also if you commit the actual terrorist act.
I mean, it does come down to, in a way, what people think terrorism is. Mm-hmm. And I've heard it defined in many ways. The most broadly would be, any politically motivated extra state use of violence, which is to say, any time an insurgency arises in a country, well, that's terrorism, because legally speaking, the state is supposed to have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. I'm assuming that the United Nations, either in its Secretariat or in the Security Council or in the General Assembly or in any of the agencies, doesn't look at terrorism like that, right?
Yeah, and that, yes, and particularly the use of the word political, I think it would be quite controversial. But let me backtrack again for a second, because we can discuss definitions of terrorism at large, right? And the variety of ways to look into that. And as I said, the UN at the political level does not agree on a single definition of terrorism. But that doesn't mean that both the Security Council and the states themselves have not agreed on what could potentially be looked as terrorism-related criminal offenses that would be then later on investigated and prosecuted, yet again backing up to the criminal space. And let me give you two quick examples. First, there is a very good definition actually adopted in Resolution 1566 of 2004 of the Security Council that looks at the commission of different violent acts. So important to underline the issue of violence, like not just thoughts or ideas, but violent kind of acting upon those ideas, whatever they are, with the motivation that it actually tends to or wants to instill terror in population at large, fear, like very basic definition, with the ultimate objective of making a government or an international organization to change path or to do or not to do. So the motivation ends up being political because you're hoping, or you're with your methodology that has to be violent, you're hoping to change course of action from a state or an international or regional organization. And one of the methods you're using is to instill fear in the population. That sounds a little bit more rounded up, but it's not a full-fledged agreed across the UN because this was only the Council. But at the same time, Jason, you may know, and I'm happy to also expand on that, there are 19 international counter-terrorism conventions that sometimes get blurred, and these are conventions that are multilateral in nature, adopted by the UN, drafted by the UN, and they have been very widely ratified, including the United States and other member states of both the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. And then codify, not all of them, but many of them do call member states that are parties of it to criminalize certain offenses as terrorist offenses in their domestic legislation, to create a particular, sentence that would, account for that, and then to cooperate internationally, as I said. Let me give you just three examples. I mean, one of the very well-known counterterrorism international instruments or conventions is the one calling for stopping and actually, holding accountable those that take hostages with a terrorist intent. These are from the 70s. There are a bunch of other international counterterrorism conventions that deal with the issue of nuclear terrorism or the use of nuclear weapons with terrorist intent. And also, again, the need to criminalize that. And there are others that look into the commission of terrorist acts against internationally protected individuals, such as diplomats. So there are a variety already. So we may not agree on what is terrorism at large, but we do know that certain offenses or certain acts are deemed to be terrorist in nature. And several of the Security Council related very basic calls to criminalize, to investigate, if appropriate, to prosecute and to cooperate internationally do become, like more tangible. There's also a very important convention on the financing of terrorism, which is very well, known and used all throughout the world. Yeah.
I'd like to come back to that, specifically financial terrorism, and also what's sometimes called cyber terrorism, what's sometimes simply called cybercrime. But before we go to that point, I'd like to rewind to something very interesting that you said about crimes that are related to terrorist undertakings, but not, strictly speaking, in and of themselves, terrorism. Could you give us some examples of those that we can think about?
Yeah, and I think you touched on an interesting point because, again, I look at the issue of crimes in particular, and there are two ways of looking at it. When it is committed with a terrorist intent, and as I mentioned a little bit before, the intent to, instill fear in the population, and also at the same time to call a political entity to change its course. So that, and with the additional element of violence, and we are also in our dialogue with member states, in my dialogue, in my role, I do have discussions with, let's say, parliamentarians or with, Ministry of Justice type of colleagues at the national level elsewhere in the world that are looking into how to criminalize certain offenses, right? And most of the time it ends up being that sometimes they forget the violence nature of it, or that they create a type of offense that it's really not even just like how you look at it in accordance with basic international human rights related principles, such as the principle of legality. You should have a very clear and precise definition when you're going to attach a criminal type of consequence to it. And sometimes they do fail to do so. So what I meant, it's like, you could have that terrorist intent, but in your own code, it might not be defined as a terrorism-related offense. It would have to be looked into the intent. And it sometimes is an aggravating circumstance in some national legal frameworks. But there are also something that, and I don't know how helpful it is going to be, Jason, as you may know, the Council also, before Resolution 1373 from 2001, had created a series of sanctions, which are not related to criminal justice. But back in 1999, Resolution 1267 of the Council had already promoted sanctions for what they call designated terrorist groups. And in that case, it was Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Today, that same regime applies to Al-Qaeda affiliate and ISIL affiliates. There's a different regime for the Taliban. And that is a very political decision of the Council to call a particular group a terrorist group, right? And in that context, the Council is not calling for those groups to be criminalized as such. It's just purely sanctions, which are purely preventive, such as travel embargo, arm embargoes, travel restrictions, and asset freezing. So it's a little bit of a back and forth. There are some offenses that could be deemed to be an aggravated circumstance terrorist in nature, and there's also the pure political designation of an entity as terrorist. And what does it mean then in the criminal justice system? It's a different question.
So when the Security Council identifies a particular organization or group as a terrorist organization and approves sanctions, how specific are they with respect to what those sanctions are and can be? That's question one. Question two, to what extent are the member states legally, of course they can do whatever they want, but to what extent are they legally bound to impose such sanctions?
Yes, thank you. Yeah. So in terms of the specific nature of the sanctions, and yet again, this is not specific to terrorism. The Security Council has a history of designating different entities and individuals very specifically by name and by, and imposing on them types of sanctions. Each sanctioned regime, and some sanctions regimes are related to, say, Central African Republic. And the criteria there is not because they're terrorist groups. It's because some groups or some individuals are defaulting on the peace process, for instance. But what's interesting about the sanctions regime I was talking about, it's because the nature there is that the council deemed the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and later ISIL as terrorists in nature, right? So that's a purely political type of decision. And member states bring, their concern, and the 15 members decide on whether, there's sufficient information. How specific the sanctions indeed they are? Well, they're quite specific. As I said, each regime, via Security Council resolution, details them. In the context, as I mentioned, of the Al-Qaeda and ISIL regime, which is the current one on 1267 plus, basically there are three types of sanctions. Individuals or members of a particular organization are subjected to travel restrictions, so they shouldn't be, allowed to move freely across borders, and we'll talk about implementation. They perhaps shouldn't be issued a passport. Their assets should be frozen, which is, very important in the context of when you're trying to stop the financing of terrorism. Because if you know that a particular individual is intent on funding or in supporting in one way, but you froze their assets, you annul the possibility of them, to be able to access their assets, then, and then how do you work? You have to work with banks, you have to work with financial institutions as the council. And the third one is the arms embargo. You would not be, as a member state, in a position to, allow for a particular individual or member to acquire weapons. How is it being implemented, and whether there is a legal obligation? Well, according to the UN Charter, it's a type of Chapter 6 type of measure under the UN Charter that the Council is taking. So in its efforts, the Council to preserve or enforce international peace and security, one of the ways is, of course, to use force, but another one is to use targeted measures that are short from force, like military force, and sanctions regimes are ones of them. So member states are bound by the charter, but then the question is actual implementation. And in that context, that particular regime has a group of experts, someone like me, I don't belong to that regime, that they discuss with the authorities, and they suggest ways for the authorities to take it forward.
Very interesting. Are there instances that you're aware of that member states have refused or declined to impose sanctions that have then themselves been sanctioned by the Security Council?
In the particular regime I'm talking about, member states are not sanctioned. It's all about terrorist related
right.
individuals or organizations.
So there would be no specific consequences if a state said, we're not going to freeze the bank accounts, or meh, passport, schmassport, technical terminology. Yeah.
It's the whole story with the Security Council itself, right? I mean, are you going to authorize the use of force to enforce a particular sanctions regime? No, but you're going to use all, persuasive methods, including the force of the council to have called you to do so. So I'm not particularly aware, because I don't work in that space, to comment on particular defaulting by member states, right? But it's the tangible nature of it, right? And member states being called to, not necessarily, but there is certainly, a series of incentives, a series of working together as part of the international community to make sure to outlaw these particular individuals or organizations. And again, I'm talking about Al-Qaeda affiliates and ISIL affiliates, which, it's kind of like, there's a little bit of consensus, I would guess, a lot of consensus around those.
And of course, terrorism isn't exclusively international, although it tends to spill across borders, in part because of how terrorist undertakings are financed.
Yes.
So that, perhaps in the old days, a terrorist organization might not need millions of dollars of resources, might not need complicated intelligence operations, might not need complicated supply chains for weapons and also militants to join the efforts. That's not the case anymore on the whole, so that terrorism is almost by definition, an international problem.
Yeah, it's a very it's something that we have to continue to monitor. And I mean, I would agree to the fact that, you know, tourism in nature tends to be international in terms of what we also call in the UN transnational, that involves more than one jurisdiction in its preparation, actual commission, and perhaps in the seeking of a safe haven in a third space. And one of the elements that you see this more clearly is in the context of what you're fully familiar with, which is, you know, the actual conflict in Syria and Iraq, where you had a very kind of like territorially speaking, you know, like kind of like circumscribed type of conflict in which you had foreigners coming to join, you know, that particular fight. And that is, you know, in that context, for instance, the Council issued 2 key resolutions referring to that situation as a typical transnational in nature type of terrorism, particularly because of the concern of all European citizens or, you know, perhaps of, you know, like Middle Eastern origin or not, that were intent to travel to the conflict zone to commit a terrorist type of act. So that was the linkage made. And in that context, the Security Council issued 2 resolutions, 2178 in 2014, when the conflict in Syria and Iraq was kind of like getting a lot of like up to speed, to stem the flow of foreign terrorist fighters, imposing on several member states the need to criminalize the intent to travel and also to cooperate internationally, particularly vis-a-vis at the border, to stop those that were wishing to travel with that intent. And then in 2017, when the conflict was waning and ISIS was losing territory or almost lost it, the Council issued a different resolution, 2396, in which it called member states to develop prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration strategies for those coming back. And you may be very familiar with the fact that many have not come back. They're still
many countries don't want to take them back.
Yes, and this is something that I do. When you were asking about my day-to-day, we work very much in this space, trying to, you know, not only advocate but convince member states on their, you know, like legal obligations to bring their own citizens back, but also how to have a strategy to deal with them, because it's not simply to bring them back, but they might have committed offenses back in Syria or Iraq, so they might need to be investigated and prosecuted, perhaps back at home. But they're also in need, and this is rather innovative for the Council to push for, to be rehabilitated, whatever that means. And that's something that we're also struggling a bit with, right? I mean, like, and also their family members, they might need support, because we know that many of them traveled with families, with husbands, wives, children, and then how to you know, finally reintegrate it back into society. Right. So that's 1 year of discussion. But I also wanted to touch, if we have a second, on the kind of domestic nature.
Yes.
And another nascent issue, and I know I'm bringing everything together, but stop me at any point. Another nascent issue in terms of domestic terrorism. I know I'm talking to a U.S. audience, so you know, like, but you know,
we're
everybody.
Eclectic. We're
very
eclectic.
Good, very good.
Yeah.
But just to say, there's a very interesting debate going on, because in the U.S. the criminal justice type of space that's called for terrorism, mostly vis-a-vis, you know, issues pertaining to material support vis-a-vis foreign terrorist organizations or transnational in nature. But there are questions pertaining, and it's something that the Council is looking into right now, something different, something related to, say, for instance, and their terminology varies widely, say racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism conducive to terrorism. That opens up a huge new kind of frontier. It's not that we're only associating terrorism with the type of 9/11 sort of attack, or ISIL or Al-Qaeda or Taliban, which are militant groups with a, like, quote unquote, religious motivation, that it's abusive in its nature, but also motivated by other like elements, but then can at the same time, be investigated and prosecuted as terrorism domestically. And those sometimes do have also, we're seeing now, that they also have a transnational, element. I mean, racially and ethnically motivated extremist speech.
Insofar as, it's violations of international law regarding human rights, violating the human rights, well, the human rights, I was going to say charter, that's not the right word, declaration. But is there anything else? I mean, is there genuine concern about destabilization of nation states that are undergoing these sorts of, in a widespread manner, these sorts of activities? I'm thinking of certain African countries where ethnic violence started with a little bit of a tit for tat kind of thing, but then enveloped the entire country and then spread to neighboring countries.
Yes, and there's huge concern about those issues. And one example that I'm very familiar with, I was desk officer for Africa for a few years at my office. We looked very intently on the role played by Boko Haram in the Lake Chad Basin. I'm talking about militant
Nigeria.
In North Nigeria, exactly. That, as you very well pointed out, it spread over boundaries and got caught into what continues to be a non-international armed conflict, but also spread into Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. Very, very, like, how to put it, like fragile states. And so in that context, of course, the kind of nihilism, behind it, we're just going to erase the normative, kind of democratic type of statehood as an objective. It's clearly what Boko Haram was looking for. Boko Haram's name says, education is forbidden. So we're not, we're hoping to kind of like create a different type of governance structure. So some of the responses we continue to advocate from the UN side is to strengthen, in that particular context of fragility, strengthen governance, because, these groups, these militant groups, for whichever reason, tend to emerge where the state is not present, where there are no services, when there's no hope, when there's no ability for somebody to get any type of employment. And it's sometimes very noted that, individuals who join terrorist organizations, they do it because of an ideology, but many times they do it just because it's a way to secure any type of means. It's about employment. This is also very crucial in, say, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is a different, very kind of like, let's say, vernacular and entrenched, terrorist group that it kind of like governs a particular territory. Right.
They run clinics. They, handle a lot of what we would consider to be the responsibilities of a government. And this is also, kind of a new-ish trend of terrorist organizations trying to hold territory, as opposed to simply terrorize and perhaps topple a regime and become the regime. Holding territory. How is that development being discussed in your circles right now?
I think the most striking example was the one that was talking about the caliphate that ISIL, tried to establish and actually succeeded in establishing for a while, and interestingly so across borders, so both in Iraq and in Syria. So completely disregarding any type of. So as I mentioned, this is being factored in terms of curtailing means of those groups via sanctions, as I mentioned, and the group has been sanctioned. There's a way in which you would try to curtail any type of, say, access not only to finances, but access to oil revenues, for instance, access to, and it's very difficult in that context because you can call member states to enforce, but how do you call private entities not to, say, for instance, sell or, or buy from a terrorist group that it's trying to ascertain and hold territory, right, and generate revenues. We're also seeing that, so I'm just saying in that context, something that the council got very worried about, it's the notion of how to undermine that organization from scratch,
Mm-hmm.
so that it wouldn't. But ideologically, it's really, where, because if they continue to have human capital, people join, and people ideologically motivated, and or else, like money-wise motivated, that is a huge source for them to continue to hold space. But also, as you know, there was a global coalition that actually went and bombed particular. So the military action, it's the key.
Yeah. I'd like to raise some issues related to counterterrorism for just a few minutes, and then hopefully there'll be some questions trickling in from the attendees, and if not, I'll just badger you with more questions, see if I don't. One concern that many of us, but perhaps not enough of us in the US have about counterterrorism is when sort of broadly, what's the right phrase to use, extra legal strategies are employed. These can be anything from use of drones for assassination, which is normally not something you do in a criminal justice type activity, or indeed in a sort of declared war sort of situation. Extra legal kidnappings, leading to extra legal incarceration in undisclosed, in many cases, extra legal prisons and camps, operated not necessarily by US or any government, but indeed by contractors hired for the purpose, and extending to long-term incommunicado incarceration of people who are never ultimately put on trial for any crime in particular, but are still held without the benefit of confronting the evidence ostensibly being held against them. Now, on the one hand, if terrorism is primarily a criminal justice issue, all of this stuff is completely and categorically ruled out, right? Seizing assets through a judicial process, you go to a judge and you say, blah, judge says, okay, the person whose assets have been frozen then have an opportunity to go into the same court for recourse. That's very different than when, a person is abducted, incarcerated, and, put away without any means of contact or advocating for themselves. So that was a long preamble about what I'm worried about and what other like-minded people are worried about. What is the UN doing on this question? Because on the one hand, there's a lot of urgency to solve the problem, right? To deal with it, to make it go away, because lives are at stake. On the other hand, if we're purporting to be approaching this in a spirit of legality and due process, there's not just the US doing this. There are many countries around the world who are violating both law, principles of due process, the rules of law, and then sometimes doing so not even with respect to what might be identified as a genuine sanctioned terrorist threat, but just people they don't like.
Yeah. So Jason, I mean, it's the absolute core of what we do to try to promote that, and this is something that it's acknowledged. by both the General Assembly and the Security Council. But yes, in this political space, right? I mean, then what happens and how to hold those member states accountable for how they conduct their counterterrorism operations. And I'm not talking about military operations only, I'm talking about civilian operations, right. Criminal justice being a part of it, not operations, but a civilian type of response to terrorism would be to criminalize a certain act and move forward, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're speaking about, the extra-legal, the non-legal, it's a huge concern for the UN, in particular for the Secretary General and the Secretary, and all of us who work for the United Nations, promoting what we would deem to be international human rights compliant counterterrorism responses. So a couple of points, of course, issues of rendition that happened in absolute, vacuum early on post 9/11, that happens all throughout the world, the kidnapping you mentioned, right? Like we've seen also like bombing from elsewhere.
I find rendition to be a bit of a euphemism.
I agree.
For putting a leather sack over someone's head and throwing them in a
You described it better. You talked about but I'm just using the language, right? I mean, I'm not. In that context, we, the Counterterrorism Committee, Executive Directorate, supporting the Counterterrorism Committee, all the Security Council language and the General Assembly language is, of course, extremely, worried, and it talks about any type of operation needs to be compliant with applicable international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And we tried as experts to make it tangible and meaningful in our bilateral discussions with member states. So we go into these discussions. Actually, the committee, the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, on behalf of the committee, visit all the 5 member states that are permanent states of the Security Council. We visited the United States, we visited France, we visited Russia, China, and the United Kingdom. And in that context, we had very lengthy discussions with the authorities about these issues and try to find ways in which to be very pointed, both what they're doing extra legally, but also what, as you pointed out, Jason, what they have on the law of the books, let's say, what they say they are doing and how then they're using those tools that, as you noted, there's an urgency. We need to combat this, but it's not, in the long term, you're only going to create more grievances if you don't do it in accordance with applicable international human rights standards, due process, fair trial, etc. Right? So that's the language. But what I can tell you that in general, we do engage with authorities, with civil society, with advocates, with practitioners to try to find in every single context what can be done better. So we engage quite a lot on, legislative processes, how they define, but then, do we, on the issue of drones, it's a huge issue. I mean, the council at the moment is looking at the use of drones by terrorist groups, but then how they're being used to counter terrorism, it's of course much more politically controversial, but there again, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, it kind of goes above counterterrorism at large. It goes to the principled approach that the United Nations takes. So, absolutely everybody aware, everybody working towards that and reducing the extra legal means as much as possible and actually, outlawing that because it's not in accordance with the call made by the council or the GA.
I'd like to ask Diana one more question of Cecilia before you go to the audience's questions. In passing, we mentioned cybercrimes. And of course, cybercrimes covers a lot of ground. It could be anything from hacking intelligence sources to financial attacks. It could also be hacking of electoral systems. It could be, of power grids, all sorts of possibilities there. Those acts are ostensibly nonviolent, right? Because it's, somebody on a keyboard. But those techniques are becoming both more common and more effective. What is the UN doing and thinking and saying in the area of cybercrime as it verges into cyber terrorism?
So I think it's a nascent issue in a sense for the terrorism link, because the UN had for many years, particularly the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, who supports member states in their, like kind of criminal justice response overall for different types of, transnational criminality, not only terrorism, looked into the issue of, that those crimes committed against data in the context of the cyberspace et al. And there are a variety of tools pertaining to how to address them. And the member states, what the UN does is support member states in sharing practices and knowledge in this space. Is it being condemned at large politically by the UN? Yes, it is. And in the context of our more recent Security Council resolution looking into our mandate, we were mandated also to look into the use or the exploitation of information and communication technologies by terrorist groups, including, you would think, the commission of cybercrime as a way with that intent. And one area we're looking at very intently is the issue of how that criminality in that space targets, for instance, critical infrastructure. Not only
targets
critical infrastructure, like hospitals or electric grids, and because there it's the terrorist intents become much more knowledgeable, or might kind of like you can see it more clearly. But again, from the UN side, and I'm talking now about the Secretariat, and I'm talking about the work that we do at the technical level, it's to promote expertise, what a country is doing. Many countries have adopted cybercrime type of strategies and have created particular means to address them. More technologically advanced countries can share with less technologically advanced countries, that create a huge gap globally on how to address those issues. So this is the role of the UN in promoting that particular expertise, if that makes sense.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah.
Diana, you've been collecting questions from the group. Would you like to take over from here?
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Naddeo, for a great discussion there. So our first question that's come from the audience is related to the definition of terrorism and how the UN perceives acts of war conducted by countries, member states, and looking at examples where some of those acts of war, acts of violence could be defined as terrorism. Is that understood that way at the UN, or is it viewed differently because it is an act of violence from a member state?
Thank you for the question. So, and being mindful about the context, I'll just give a very brief kind of answer to begin the discussion. Definitely all the 19 international counterterrorism instruments I mentioned, the conventions, and the relevant Security Council resolutions I talked about, and the GA kind of stance on these issues, it's not about member states committing any type of terrorist offense. It's about non-member states, individuals committing that offense, not in the name of a particular state. So we would call state terror. It's not the realm of what we're doing in this particular context of the UN. But at the same time, international humanitarian law, which defines, type of criminality as serious violations of it, conducted by any party to a conflict, does have a particular definition of terrorism. It does talk about, parties to the conflict, which could be a state, if it's an international conflict, committing type of criminality with a terrorist intent, and call member states to address it. So in that context, it's possible to address member states' actions as terrorists in the context of international humanitarian law, but it would not be in the context of international counterterrorism efforts, which speaks about individuals or organizations that are not state-related committing the type of criminality I spoke about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Somewhat related, in terms of defining terrorism, could they be defined as crimes against humanity? One of the audience members referenced the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and some of that lends itself to the actions of terrorist campaigns.
No, that's an excellent question. And yes, and something that we started talking a little bit at the beginning with Jason in terms of what we call international criminal law and international criminal justice. So as you know, and I don't want to be definitional again, but crimes against humanity, it's about the systematic, kind of like, and constant type of engagement in a particular targeting of a group and addressing a particular type of criminality. Again, I think the context for it to become of relevance vis-a-vis terrorism relates to the intent, but the Rome Statute does not address terrorist intent in any of its language. And also, I think when, for instance, something that we're looking at in my space is when crimes against humanity are being committed by what we call designated terrorist groups, or groups that had been politically noted to be terrorist in nature. So there, in that context, it's not enough to just perhaps, for instance, in the context of somebody that's committing rape in a systematic fashion, right, as a group, that it's being designated as terrorist. Is it enough to say we're going to prosecute you members of that group for belonging to a terrorist group? Or are we more intent, if we're talking about victims' rights, to actually, look into more meaningful accountability and look what type of conduct you have committed? You've raped people, right? So in that context, it's when, crimes against humanity can definitely be committed by designated terrorist groups, and we would have a say in that space to encourage member states to look into the basic conduct, not just to stay with preparing to commit a terrorist act, travel to commit a terrorist act, be a member of a terrorist group, but actually, also push for going into. It won't be done in the context of the Rome Statute. What we would be advocating would be national legislation addressing those issues, if that makes sense. So a domestic type of criminal, like intervention.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. The next question I have is, I guess, a question about the view from the UN, if we can look at that. What are some positive developments and or disturbing trends that the UN is concerned with as it relates to terrorism activity and addressing this activity around the world?
I always like to know if something's going right. So maybe you could tell us about a positive trend or two.
So the question is about UN observed positive trends in this space, as well as some challenges, right? Like more generally speaking. So yeah, I would also like to see some positive trends, but in this space, let's start with the challenges. A challenge that we observed many times is what you alluded to, Jason, is the use of counterterrorism related legislation, that it's very clearly and precisely defined on the books to actually address types of activities that are not criminal in nature, because they're not violent or they're actually political protest or dissent, right? So that is a concerning trend, and it had been noted that the UN, with its very kind of like very positive intent to try to call member states to criminalize this type of offenses, it might be just being subservient if we don't insist on how to do so, right? Rightly so, to perhaps the persecution of minority, persecution of political dissent. So that's one hugely concerning trend and something that we constantly advocate against. Something perhaps, let's say, a bit more positive, if you so will, is the UN moving into the preventive space. It's not only the reactive space. It's not only let's criminalize, let's curtail funding, let's, preventive in the sense of how do we counter that ideology. That can be read as being positive, but also another type of minefield, right? But I think it's rightly so understood that there is a need to engage. And in this context, something that the UN is struggling with, it's how to meaningfully engage, say, advocates, civil society, like women's groups, youth activists in this discussion, particularly how to sway those that might be recruited to commit terrorist acts to do against so. And this is something that you may relate, as I mentioned, the 15 members of the Security Council got together post 9/11 and said member states should do. This is a trend that it's kind of like, now we know that this is not enough. We need grassroots organizations to be engaged in this space and to do it in their own rightful space without member states, So how member states cooperate with grassroots, with civil society to actually, touch upon the pre-recruitment space or the incitement space. And this is something that the UN is, trying to be a bit more smart, to engage more, but it's a hugely complex area. because member states politically do not want to let go their power to, address these issues forcefully. But at the same time, they're aware that without civil society, without advocates, without grassroots, that hopefully are not being called terrorists by those member states, they cannot really move, forward in terms of stemming individuals doing it.
Makes a great deal of sense.
I think we're just about out of time, but perhaps
I have one more question. Cecilia, I always like to try to get some career advice, and it's too late for me. It's probably not too late for Diana. It's definitely not too late for the other members of our audience. So if you would be willing to impart some advice to students who are thinking about international law, thinking about either working at the UN or in UN-related NGOs or in any of these sectors, what advice would you give them, and maybe what advice would you give your younger self?
That make it a bit more kind of tangible. What I would say to myself, like many years ago, and I think I think a couple of points. I think it's important to be very flexible in your thinking. You're, coming into a completely different environment. You're not already, the international education system. It's quite, varied as it was perhaps 20 years ago, but the ability to be in an international institution as you are here, with the ability to start thinking more flexibly, listen to what others are saying, not only just to yourself, be able to take feedback and move forward. I think it's a lot about, for the UN at large and international legal kind of space at large, you need to know how to communicate, how to write, of course in English, which is the lingua franca, but if you have a second or third, language that would not hurt. I think it's as I said, I think it kind of comes back to self-reflection, being flexible, listen to what others have to say, and be nimble in adapting, because it's a hugely, fluid environment, very charged politically in whichever, even though we're in a legal space, as we have discussed today, it's clear that even definitions themselves, which are the basis of it, are still political in nature. There's no other way. So the legal space helps a lot, but in the end, you have to be able to navigate politics. And I would say to myself also to be perhaps take a bit more field type of related activities. If you have the opportunity at Fairleigh Dickinson to take, some time to go to the field, to work with the UN in the field, to work with an NGO, it's not all about the UN. I mean, NGOs are doing amazing jobs everywhere. Regional organizations are amazing. The Organization of American States, the Council of Europe, OSCE, you will get a lot of exposure. I would personally tell myself, you need a little bit more time in the field, though I spent some time, then to be able to come here, because once you are at the HQ, it's difficult to go back to the field. You're at the strategic level discussing. So I guess, I hope that's kind of helpful, but it's a lot about communication and politics and understanding the use of legal tools to advance not non-described political, but actually political objectives that you agree with, and they're in agreement with the principles of the UN Charter.
Thank you so much. Diana, do we have any announcements before we break for today?
Well, we hope to have some additional programs coming up, so I'll let the audience know to be aware of those coming up in April. So we'd love to have you join us as well. And as you may have noted, the event is being recorded, so it will be available in a few days on our YouTube channel. So feel free to access that for your research and reference. And
share with friends, and thumbs up.
Thumbs up to all, yes, especially to Dr. Naddeo for
Thank you so much for joining us and being such a good sport. Thank you, Diana, for organizing this affair. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Bye-bye.